Okay.
I'm going to be tonally developing the arm, and for the purposes of bringing in a fuller sense of volume and form. And so one of the first steps that we've got to do is to get the shadow mass on the side of the arm graphically dark. So we call this postering in the shadow mass. And so with graphite, that means that we've got to slowly build up the tone in the shadow mass in a very flat way. So what I'm doing right now is just using fairly rapid but lightweight strokes right off the tip of a very sharp pencil. And we want to make sure to maintain that sharpness throughout the process. So the tip of the pencil is we maintain that point. And we deliver these little rapid hatch lines across the surface. And the first pass that we make, the goal is just to have a flat tonal fill to that shadow area. So you might notice that ahead of time I've mapped out in a linear way, I've mapped out all of the edges of the shadow mass. And that's what we call the terminator line. So the edge or termination of the light, the scientific term for that is the terminator. So a flat graphic fill within the lines of the terminator is called postering in the shadow mass. And I don't rush this process. I take my time to let the graphite slowly build up to a dark value. And one of the reasons why I've chosen the arm here is that it's a fairly small, relatively small form. And it only takes a moment to poster in the shadow mass. You can see the larger shadow mass that's already been rendered and subsequently rendering out into the light mass. That took quite a bit of time in the previous session with the model. Postering in the shadow mass took a great deal of time, and then all of the modeling out in the light mass took a lot of slow rendering to turn the form and to make a sculptural and volumetric turning of the form. But with the arm, we can poster in the shadow mass pretty quickly, and we can get a nice dark value. So once the shadow mass is postered in to a nice dark value, we begin the process of rendering and tonally developing the light mass. And the critical move here is to immediately take what is a linear terminator edge to the shadow mass shape. And we need to create a sense of turning there. So the first thing that happens is that the artist needs to open up that edge by rendering short, small, lightweight hatch marks, which are essentially parallel to the terminator's edge. And in doing that, this parallel rendering right up against the terminator edge, we can instantaneously open up the shadow edge to become, instead of a sharp, rigid corner on the form, we can make it into a tonally gradating turning of the form. It's an artist's term that we like to use when we take something which is two-dimensional and graphic, and then suddenly we start to invoke this sense of three-dimensional volumetric illusion to the form in the drawing. We can say that we are turning the form. So that's our first step here, is to render parallel to the terminator edge. And literally what I'm rendering here is a very special behavior in the light that we call halftone or half light. And scientifically, what's happening is the light rays are becoming they're becoming tangent to the form. So rather than the light ray heavily impacting the form like it does at the top plane of the shoulder, or a more perpendicular illumination like at the front plane of the bicep where it gets very bright, the light ray is just scathing past the form right at this moment called the half light. So it is actually light right here, but it's the darkest value that we can have in the light mass and still qualify it as light. And rendering the halftone accomplishes a couple of goals for us. It starts to give us the illusion of turning form, but it also creates a gateway and an opening in the rendering process where we can leave the shadow mask and start to model subtle secondary forms in the light mass. So for example, I'm now hatching in the open light area across the surface of the deltoid, and I'm trying to create some volumetric feeling there. I'm careful though to monitor the value range that I'm working in. I don't want to use values that are similar to what I've used in the shadow mask. I need to show a clear difference in value to the viewer that these values are shadow mask values, and outside of that we have areas which are affected by the direct light source. And that is the major obstacle and major pitfall for many beginning students' drawings, is the lack of awareness that goal needs to happen in a drawing, is a clear division between light mass and shadow mass. Now, something that comes up very quickly when we start rendering across the form and modeling across the form is the difference in shadow edges that we have. So far down the outside edge of the arm, we've been modeling what we call a form shadow. And that's just a result of the inherent structural form of the arm having changing planes that come to fall out of the affect of the light. So a quicker way to say that is that the form turns away from the light. We don't mean it's literally rotating, but we mean that the form changes so that it falls out of the affect of the light. And we have what's called a form shadow. But over here, coming off of the pectoralis and somewhat across the deltoid and now spilling down the inside of the bicep, we have a cast shadow. So there's two different types of shadows that we work with. And one of these is form shadow, the other is cast shadow, and that's created when the form blocks the light. The difference, the major difference between them that we need to concern ourselves with, is that the form shadow is a soft gradient edge. Because most of the time in the human figure, what we're rendering is some sense of roundness, some sense of turning, gradating form, and therefore the edge of the form shadow has a gradation to it. It's a softer, out of focus edge. Whereas cast shadow is a much sharper, harder line. It's much more graphic in nature. And so it is postered and filled in pretty rapidly. So when the model comes back from the break, I'm going to continue open modeling across the form of the bicep and hopefully continue to turn the form there.